Thank you, Juliet. Thank you for having me here. And as a former college professor, I love to talk to an audience of college students, in part because I wrote this book originally because it came out of my experiences trying to explain the civil rights movement to college students, to young people, of which this event was 40 or 50 years in the past, and seemed sometimes irrelevant to them, or not a part of their lives, or not an experience that they could relate to. So in many ways, I thought of this story and the way I wanted to tell it and the way I wanted to explain it to make it relevant to an audience of younger people who didn't live through it and who saw it as something in the remote past and not relevant to their lives. And as Juliet pointed out, this week marks the 50th anniversary of the start of the sit-ins, February 1st, 1960. A key turning point in the civil rights movement, I think the key turning point. It's a pivotal moment in my book. And so I thought I'd devote most of my talk to the sit-ins and to explaining why I think it's a turning point. And I think it ties together some of the themes of my book, turning it back to its roots and then looking forward to the repercussions of the sit-ins. As you can see, my book is called The Shadows of Youth, and it examines what I call the life arc of the civil rights generation. And at the core of that are the young activists who led the sit-ins and then started SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was in existence from 1960 to about 1970, or a few years afterward. Its end sort of tapered off. It's the most important and I think least appreciated organization of the 1960s. SNCC was formed in April 1960 by the college students, as I said, who were behind the sit-ins. It was a driving force behind the Freedom Rides of 1961. It organized the Freedom Summer of 1964. Its tactics changed the dynamics of the civil rights movement, making both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 possible, and inspiring the anti-war movement, the opposition to the Vietnam War. If Martin Luther King wrote the poetry of the movement, SNCC acted out its prose, putting flesh and blood to the abstractions of democracy and freedom and citizenship that made the civil rights movement possible. The life of SNCC was brief. Its most effective days were over by 1967, though elements of it, as I said, lingered on into the 1970s. My book is about more than just the movement in the 60s, hence the subtitle is Civil Rights Generation, as I follow the careers of important SNCC leaders through the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. We can see here some of the leaders of SNCC as youth, and then today. More than anything, three questions drove my writing of this book. The first two were more sort of personal human questions, and I wanted to know what it was like to be in the grip of history as a young person. What did it feel like to be at the center of history when you were 20, 21, 22 years old, and how to make that come alive? And sometimes to me, the civil rights movement and its actors were presented as bland as the Puritans seemed to me as a high school student, which is they were robbed of all the things that made them exciting, their youth, their vigor, and the kind of adventure story in some ways that the civil rights movement was. This was an incredibly dynamic moment, and so I wanted to kind of restore some of that sense of adventure to the civil rights movement. And also, I was curious, and we could talk about this in the question and answer period, what happens to you if you change the world before you're 30? What do you do with the rest of your life? And how does that shape the kind of person you're going to become and the kind of person you are? How do you live with that? And how does that shape you? And I thought that the civil rights activists of SNCC were a good example of that here. They were about 20 when the movement began. They first got involved. They're not even 30 in most cases when what we think of the civil rights movement comes to an end. And as it's happening, they know it's the most important, the most exciting, the most dramatic thing they're probably going to do in their lives. And then they live, in some ways, in the shadow of that for the rest of their lives. And certainly, we as a nation live in the shadow of the activism of the 60s. It's colored how we think about politics, how we think about youth. It's colored almost everything we think about this country. So I thought about that. And the third question I was interested in was a kind of larger one of greater historical importance, which is, and one thing I've puzzled over as a historian, which is, why did the civil rights movement happen when it did? Why didn't it happen in, say, the 1920s or the 1940s, or maybe even 20 years later in the 1980s? Why in the 1950s and 1960s did legal segregation in the South collapse? And especially, why was 1960 a key turning point? It's something I've always puzzled over as a historian and thought about and wanted to explain a little bit, which is what was it about this particular moment in time that was unique or different? Let me take you back to January 1960 and to set the scene for what's going to happen. The South is segregated, and this famous photograph typifies the separation of the races that existed in the South. Separate water fountains, separate restrooms, separate sitting rooms, and bus and train stations. Signs like this at restaurants. But segregation, as Juliet pointed out, was under attack. The Brown decision had happened in 1954. The Montgomery bus boycott had happened in 1955 and 1956. There had been the Little Rock and Virginia school desegregation crises. Martin Luther King had emerged as an important national figure. Yet it's also worth noting how little had changed by 1960. 6 years after Brown, school desegregation was hopelessly mired in the courts. Fewer than 1 in 1,000 African American students attended an integrated school in the South. The number is actually closer to probably 1 in 5,000, depending on how you define the South and how you calculate what an integrated school is. But the point is that Brown had proceeded extremely slowly. Enthusiasm for the Montgomery bus boycott had dissipated. In many ways, Martin Luther King was lost and drifting. As the cover of this Time magazine shows, he was the most famous African American in the nation, and yet he'd had trouble turning the success of the boycott into a kind of enduring movement, and progress seemed to stall out. And many worried that the civil rights movement, such as it was, had stalled out or was in danger of falling apart. And I think the best way to illustrate this is to talk about one of King's biggest critics, a woman named Ella Baker, who also happened to be the executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the organization that King formed after the Montgomery bus boycott. And Baker, she's one of the great figures in the civil rights movement, not very well known. She had come of age in the 1920s. She had been the valedictorian of her class at Shaw University. She had moved to New York, to Harlem in the 1920s, where she had organized tenants and poor people. In the 40s, she was a branch organizer for the NAACP, traveling around the South, helping establish new NAACP branches. And by the 1950s, she had taken a job as the executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And the best way to think about Baker's criticism of King is just to take 1 second to think about the organization he formed and to just examine the title, which I think probably most of us have never done, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And every word in the organization's name bothered Ella Baker. It was Southern. Ella Baker thought the movement should be national. She didn't think that the problem, although she recognized that segregation was a Southern institution, she understood that racism was a national problem, and she thought it should be addressed nationally. Christian. Ella Baker was a devoted churchgoer, but she thought the question of segregation was a political one, less than it was a religious one, and that the organization should be thinking in terms of politics. Leadership. She dreamed of a mass movement, not a movement of leaders and not a movement of elites. And she was particularly critical of preachers who she thought were trained to speak to an audience, not with an audience. You know, preachers stand on the pulpit and they deliver sermons. And she thought that an organization should come from the bottom up, not the top down.